Welcome to the very first episode of the Spirit Level Studio. I'm your host, Kieran, and I started this series to have honest conversations with people shaping construction today. We're cutting through the noise, talking challenges, wins, and what it really takes to move the industry forward. To kick things off, I'm joined by Tom Whiting, someone who's been right in the thick of it, leading teams and driving change from the ground up. In this episode, we dive into his journey, lessons learned the hard way, and why now's the time for construction to embrace smarter ways of working. Let's get into it. If I knew nothing about construction, how would you best describe what you do?
I would basically compare it to looking after Spotify. So a common data environment, for example, is actually just Spotify, just in a different industry. So it's storing all music. And how do you do that? So we don't actually own Spotify or run Spotify. We don't kind of run the common data environment. But what we do is we sit and understand how all the different works, so whether it's Apple Music, Spotify, or whatever it is, make sure we store information in the right way in a structured format to actually fit ISO 19650, which is obviously an industry specific term, but actually it's the genre, the artist, the length of the song, the year. This is all metadata. And what we make sure is everyone's using consistent metadata within a system and structure that. The reason we kind of do it and we're not with the software, how we try and actually manage that process is we sit as information management within that construction sector. And we look at how a client works, whoever they are, whether they're a contractor or an asset owner, understand their processes to make sure they're capturing the right data. So when they use whatever system they've selected, they can surface it in the right way. So we try and do it from an agnostic way instead of being a software point. Make sure that they first of all, they select the right system and then they surface the information in the right way within the system to suit their needs.
In your view, what does good look like in that space?
For me, not have lots of people have lots of systems. It's actually about understanding what's going to add value and actually just taking a step back of not just how are you using that system, but what you're using it for, which is sometimes a difficult question to ask. Of like, we've bought a system because we could, and we've heard we need one, but actually, what is your use case for that system, and concentrating on that use case, and then driving down into, okay, are you maximizing that use case before we move on to other use cases? The analogies, I like lots of analogies. So you buy a mobile phone, why'd you buy an iPhone? You could buy a standard Nokia, so to speak. It still has that purpose of being a phone, but actually we should concentrate on you using the phone in the right way as a phone before we go on to email management and all these different kind of functions. So because again, it's returning back to kind of return on investment and making sure you understand the use cases for that product. When you do it from that point, you start looking at actually, are you using the right product? Because sometimes you can have a choice of you could do things in one system or another system or another system. So you're actually rolling it back to kind of what we're actually trying to do is fundamentally have a conversation with the people. How do you work? Understand the process and then implement their technology in the right way. And every time going back to kind of people, that process, what you're trying to use it for, and then into implementing the technology.
Yeah, because I think I see a lot of people kind of buy systems, kind of similar to a conversation we've had before, because that's what
Yeah.
other people are doing. Um,
Mhm.
and maybe that's not necessarily the right decision. Um, and maybe they need to kind of get their ducks in a row first before they.
Yeah.
So would you guys kind of sit in before that process to get the ducks in a row, or would you suggest kind of bringing the system in first, then kind of doing that process altogether?
The danger of kind of getting the system in first is the it's the why. So why have you bought that system? Like I said, it's really easy. Obviously, you can talk to kind of different providers and understand some things. Some of them will be kind of low hanging fruit. You need someone to solve. You need a system to solve a certain business case. Um, but then actually, when you kind of, if you're rolling it back, what are the other business cases that you could solve? Are they, if you would kind of Moscow them, so must have, should have, could have, kind of will or won't have, or nice to have, it becomes a bit of a rating system. Um, a lot of the time you can see that someone might have chosen one system and it might solve one thing, but actually they've got 3 or 4 things afterwards in a backlog that they'd like to solve. And actually, if they'd not jumped into that system, even though they're not going to need it day one, they end up with a migration, and migrations are never nice from one system to another system, but they end up having to go through that process because they've selected the wrong system for them.
Yeah.
Which is always a challenge. Like, so ideally, obviously, we're in before we can help build that business case for the right system, help make sure they're asking the right questions, and then helping them on that journey through that tender process. And it obviously can become a difficult waiting. There's obviously commercials, and sometimes you have to start with one system because of your digital maturity within a business. So actually, you might have to go on a journey of through multiple systems, knowing you're not going to use additional functionality, because sometimes you don't need to um, you don't need a flying car, if we use that analogy, to go from A to B, or a helicopter. Sometimes you need to start on that journey of actually, for what we need right now and for the next cycle of what we're going to sign this deal for, this is the right solution for us. But it's also important to know that you've bought that solution for that reason. That's your business case for buying it. And when you want to take up the next step, you're going to move on to another system, because that again, it's connected to the return on an investment, which also kind of makes it really clear of why you've bought that system, what you're going to use it for, and also what you're not going to use it for, because sometimes that's quite a powerful thing to kind of step back and go, you've made that decision and you're not doing those things here. So let's be clear, it's not. Sometimes we kind of get involved in a situation where a client and a software provider are not necessarily at loggerheads, but the client's unhappy because the system's not doing something that they thought it could do. And actually, they're like, well, we never told you we could do that. How do you unpick that? So we find it quite useful to make sure you kind of sit down and understand your requirements, like from a client side, whoever's buying that system, make sure they need to be clear of you. No one ever said that was going to be done. It also wasn't your use case of why you were buying the system. So especially at like renewal points and things like that.
Okay. Yeah. And I guess if you were like, so obviously the big companies, the tier one contractors, have whole teams who are essentially dedicated to doing this process. If I was a smaller business and I didn't necessarily have a department that was kind of dedicated to, I guess, digital transformation, bringing in new systems, and maybe I don't have the budget as a contractor to bring in someone like an Amodal, what would be the best place? Where would I start?
So I had this conversation with someone the other day. I would start with post-it notes is the kind of the best way of starting, and just literally put them out of understanding what do you want something to do. So what's your kind of high level processes? Contract management, a document storage system. Do you want a field kind of system? Is it online, offline? And you can start. It's a very easy thing to workshop with people in a room. Don't need to pay anyone to kind of do it. And then what you're kind of doing is understanding what things you need as a business, and then you can kind of, you put them on a whiteboard, start drawing lines between those post-its of like understanding that, does that common data environment well, let's go right back to the basics. Does the document storage need to talk to a field solution? Can they be one and the same? Is there a connection between them? Do you need those things? And then what you're actually starting to do is understand your requirement catalog at that point. So when you go to market, you can talk to a provider of going, we just want you to do that. Can you do this? Because you understand your kind of the relationships of what system needs to talk to what system. And also it's back to what are your use cases. You can drill down within this kind of concept. So around, you've got document storage, you've got form processes, and I would split out business forms, kind of project-based forms, site-based forms. So an RFI is very different to a snag,
Yeah.
for example. How you're using them is different. So things become generalized very easily. So you do need to drill down a little bit. But once you start putting down what forms do we need to do within that category, you can understand kind of, well, how many forms are you going to build within a system? What else could you do? And it becomes quite an easy way of doing it. So post-its are the best way of starting. It's nice and easy. You know what you're doing. And then you can ask someone to kind of come in and going, what are we missing? So I'd quite like then talk to the providers of, this is, instead of me showing you what I've got, why don't you tell me what you think is best practice? Because the providers will show you, well, others people do this. So also from the kind of smaller organizations, without the providers will be perfectly happy of, normally our standard setup covers these 10 things. And if you've only got 5 of them, well, actually you're understanding that you're going to potentially get additional benefit, whether you want to utilize those or not, or you might realize that you've missed something and not considered it. So you can add that post-it down, that kind of methodology. You end up with a kind of a spider diagram at the end of it all.
Okay, interesting.
And the other nice bit of doing it that way is once you then buy that tech, you can then draw a big circle around what that tech's doing. So you then got a defined use case for that tech. Um, and you also know where your gaps are. So do you want other tech to close the other gaps? You might buy a system that doesn't do contract management, is the example, or doesn't do tendering. So do you close those, or how process, you roll it back to process? Do you do tendering via email, or do you want a system?
Obviously, finding the right system is probably half the battle as well. It's very easy, I think, when you go onto Google, or a lot of people now are, typing in construction management software into ChatGPT, and it brings you up a list of providers, which is ultimately pulling from sources like Capterra and G2. How do you think, without being sucked into what big websites are saying, what people are paying for on Google Ads, how do you think you get the best solution for your business? Because obviously
I think, yeah,
there's obviously in the industry there's people that use certain softwares. The big guys use certain softwares, the smaller guys use certain softwares as well. And it's easy to go, well, Joe Blogs down the road uses XYZ, so we should use them, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's probably right. I mean, what's your thoughts?
get back it. So looking at the tech first is always that dangerous bit, but understanding what's out there is a useful bit. So once you've understood, kind of without repeating myself, of what your requirements are, and you're going to go to market and select system, understanding what's out there, you should look at multiple sources. Obviously, just going to a ChatGPT and give me a list of 5 providers that do these things is a little bit dangerous. There is obviously other ways of looking and finding things. You could go to Digital Construction Week was the other week. Which stands were there? Just go through the list of the stands. It won't take you more than half an hour to read every single stand that was there. What do those providers do? Are they a potential one to include? Have I missed them? And you will naturally end up picking up the smaller SME companies will be there probably at those sorts of events. And there's a couple of those events, London Build and all those sorts of things, that might open your eyes to other things that you've not thought of and easily have missed. And then you can go down a little bit of research, understand who the providers are, um, and then there will have to be a bit of an outreach to kind of qualify them in and qualify them out of whether they're right for you or not.
And obviously, when people bring in softwares, they tend to lock in. I mean, you'd like to think they lock in for a good period of time, but if I look at sort of tier one contractors in general, and some of them I've known to change quite frequently over the last kind of 10 to 15 years, whereas you've got some guys who've been on the same system for much, much longer, um, especially some of the smaller kind of tier two and tier three contractors. Why do you think the industry is so reluctant to change?
So it's not just in software. No one likes change as much as we like to say we're innovative. People push back on change. It's a huge thing. You've trained everyone in your business how to use something and how to work in a certain way. If you change for something, that why change, right? So there's going to be a motivating factor behind the change. If commercials are working for you and the system seems to be okay, change will come with a risk of pushback and things you don't know. You're going into the unknown. So people don't like to do it necessarily, but they also don't know how to do it as well. So um, if we flip it into a different industry, banking, no one changes their bank, and then the switching service comes out, and it's really easy to kind of flip from one bank to another bank without interacting with them, and you can change that. So because people don't know how to do it in the process that they would go on, you end up with these tails of existing contracts in flight. Do you move contracts in flight? How do you do it? It becomes quite complicated and risky fundamentally. So I think there's a bit of a gap of lack of understanding of how to go through that process, and you're paying for multiple systems at once, and then the commercials become a barrier.
Yeah.
On top of that, the only way it's going to change if somehow there's um, mobile phones, you go from Apple to Android, you turn your phone on, like, well, you used to be over here, do you want to pull all your information over? Like, there's a transfer of data, and everyone talks about APIs and, oh, we've got an API from this system to this system. The reality of like rolling these things out tends to be a lot more complicated. Just because you say you can do something doesn't mean it's the practicality of doing it, and people shy away from that.
Yeah, and I guess on the change management process, you mentioned people are reluctant to change at the start. you've obviously got people in the office who obviously tend to make these decisions, and you've obviously got the people on the ground who are doing the work who get affected. How do you think you best inflict change in a positive way so that you get buy-in from people and people actually use systems to their full potential?
Okay. So to get change in a positive way, like you kind of just said, is about looking at the entire organization of who's using what. What you tend to kind of see is people will rise obviously within a business through their time served. And actually you can end up with people higher up in the business are quite comfortable with the system because they know how to use it. And they can not be necessarily become exposed, but if they know how to use the system, they're going to move something else, not really in the position of using it. They can be reluctant to that. But it's back to, I always feel it's useful to every few years, not necessarily a market test to go to market or anything like that, but just to step back, have a look of what do the other providers do. You can go to conferences and things like that and get that sort of information to understand why aren't we doing that. So just looking at it from a business of like understanding those processes, things with like a good example would be augmented reality. Do we do it as a business? Why don't we do it as a business? There's nothing wrong with not doing it as a business, but another system might do it. So should you go on that change journey if you want to do it and you understand that business case, then that will start driving. That's when you can be a little bit technology led, but it doesn't mean just because that one system does it, that's the only one to go down. It's back to looking at how you work is the right way, and then going, wait a minute, we're carrying risk here. Should we carry that risk? How are you keeping all your photogrammetry records in the AR world? Actually, you're not really doing them. You're missing lots of information. We need a solution through site walkthroughs. Do we buy new tech as a side along that will do that, or can we embed it within our existing tech?
And I think what was really something quite interesting. You said obviously augmented reality, which is quite a new kind of piece of technology that's come to the industry. What do you, if I was a company, I'm completely paper based still. I do everything from Word and Excel, which
Yeah.
is still quite common. What do you think are the like key processes and areas that just are like a not almost like a non-negotiable really to digitalize? Like a base pack almost of software that you should be bringing in as a business.
So from a starting point, the simpler is the better. The the problem is, I know I just said about AR, but if you try and do everything, you'll kind of get nowhere. You'll sit and think about it and you'll take so long. So I see the better way to digitize is go on the incremental process. So also if you're looking, it helps on change as well. So if you look at a change curve, you kind of have that, oh, this is great, and then you get the resistance and it comes down, and then you have to kind of help people manage through that life cycle until they come out the other side and go, actually, this was the right thing to do. But you have to fight all that resistance. Whereas if you're doing that, that curve becomes bigger, the bigger the change. If you're doing smaller incremental changes, that it doesn't become smoother. There's still an element of kind of risk. So if you're in a kind of a paper-based world, I would say actually just look at a couple of those processes. How could you digitize those processes? What I see sometimes that doesn't necessarily work as well for some of the organizations that go straight from paper to digital is they just copy,
Hmm.
so to speak, of like, that's the form, rebuild that form, so to speak, of whatever it is, because actually that's the opportunity to change of actually, can we simplify that process? Do we need every single one of those fields in? Can the system answer, like, I know your name's Kieran, so why is that cell not filled in automatically? It's a very base level. I know what your role is in the company, so that should be put in. I know who you work for. I know what the date is. I know what the weather is, because I can pull that information from somewhere else. So whereas it could be a drop down of like categorization of certain bits and pieces. So how can we help users input data in a more efficient way? Because if we don't, what's the value to them? Like the kind of the other thing that does happen is people aren't thinking about the end user, the inputter of that source. So things might drive up to exec level board reports, but if we can make their kind of process easier and more efficient to get information into these systems, they'll naturally adopt it because it'll be better for them. So I definitely kind of start small and build, um, and just let some things, if you are on paper, let some things stay in paper. Like if it's partly working fine, get the value, get the value where you can get the value. Where's your pain? Where's your pains as a business? What's going to unlock value by digitizing that process? Go from there.
What do you think if I'm still using paper as a business? What do you think I'm not? What do you think I'm missing out on, I guess?
paper as a business, I wouldn't say it's about what you're missing out on. I tend to look at it from the inefficiencies that you naturally are just accepting without realizing. So if you're in paper and you've got to send it to someone, how are you sending it to someone? Are you paying for someone to scan that document? Are you putting it in the post? You've then lost the record, so you're probably going to keep a copy somewhere. So that's an overhead within a business that you're carrying without realizing. And if you've got lots of projects, even if you're a small organization, you've got lots of little kind of micro overheads all over the place. And what you can see as you implement stuff is a shift in resource of who's involved in kind of collating that information, because it's a different person. That person that was doing kind of some admin tasks, let's say, now starts to do a slightly different, their role starts to shift because information, someone could fill in information, it could go directly to someone else through a workflow, for example. So it doesn't actually touch that person, but that person starts to become an information manager because they're probably the person that was passing it through starts to say, by the way, you've got these tasks. So there can be a natural evolution in kind of roles. And actually it's understanding where things are, and they can, as that person starts to develop, or if it has to be new resource, and that's fine, you start to understand blockers within your workflows of actually they were chasing that person every single time and no one really knew that kind of person in the back end was sending 50 emails a week to one person. Like, can you do this one now? Can you do this one? Can you do this one? Can you do this one? So you've kind of got that inherent kind of problem that people won't realize.
Because I see it like when I speak to, for example, yesterday I went to a site actually in London and spoke to a young site manager who's only like 22, 23, and we were actually having a conversation about digital platforms, etc., etc. And you could tell he was kind of excited by it. Do you think it's a bit of a generational thing as well? Like, 'cause some of the older guys in the industry are kind of like it always worked on paper. I've done it that way, so why would I change?
Yeah, there's a comfort, right? Again, it's back to change that we've always done it this way. Why do it this way? Construction is brick on top of brick.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, like how much has it actually changed? Yes, we've kind of got some modern methods of construction, but a lot of it fundamentally hasn't changed. But we do have the problem is we do have an aging workforce. There is new people coming in. We have to find new ways of doing it to meet labour shortages. That's only going to continue. The only way of doing that will be to digitize. But again, if people aren't kind of as computer savvy and they're kind of the people educating new people coming in, they can feel they're becoming exposed.
Mm.
So they can kind of push back and go, no, we're going to do it this way. So time hopefully will unlock that, and people need to kind of push back in the right way. And that I kind of view it as up management, so to speak. So there can be a hierarchical of like your manager, you're kind of that person underneath, but actually there's nothing wrong with kind of up managing of like that kind of new 22-year-old site manager helping his boss of like, look, like look at this. Actually, I can save you some time. I'll help you in it. So that's kind of up management, upskilling. Even though someone's more experienced, actually they can teach each other things. It doesn't have to be a one way street.
Yeah, the other, cause interesting you say on the kind of young person, because obviously, and you mentioned aging workforce within construction. There's obviously, I don't think a lot of people don't glamorize construction, but I love working construction. I never thought when I went to school that I would work in construction. How do you think, as a person in your position, because the field you do is it's very niche part of construction, it's such a broad. How do you think we help younger people, you know, come into construction? Because I think certainly younger people are like, they look at Instagram and they think that they're all going to become forex traders and investment bankers and drive Ferraris, but that's not the reality of the world. So, how do you think we help younger people come into the industry as well?
So to help younger people come into the industry, like you said, there's the perception of what construction is. It's on site at weekends with muddy boots. You've got to be a man to go into it. And how is that ingrained within people? Like, we need to go back to how are we educating people in their careers choice, and this won't be obviously isolated to construction. Things are kind of quite broad, like engineers, maths and physics. Like males, you go that way, and that's kind of how it evolves. unfortunately. Like it does need to change. We need to find ways of going, actually, there is all of these kind of additional roles within it. It's not just kind of on that. It has to become a more attractive place to work, again, to meet those skill shortages that are going to happen. And the industry has to adapt, like look at how COVID has changed things. We're having this remotely. A few years ago, this would never be remote. It would all be face to face. So the industry can change, or people's behaviors can change, and we just need to kind of help people. It is harder when you're kind of dealing with that kind of school age group of how do we get into kind of educate them. And for me, it comes back to not necessarily the teachers, but kind of the careers advisors. How do we educate the careers advisors to make sure because they're the ones that are kind of saying, have you thought about this? Do you know about that? We probably need to just change tact of, yes, there's all STEM as its entirety, but how do we kind of open that world of what does STEM mean?
Yeah, definitely. And I guess, are there any jobs that you're seeing that maybe don't exist now that you think are going to exist or play a huge part in construction, maybe in sort of 5 years' time, that if you were a young person coming through, you could go, well, that could be really exciting.
Okay, so how the industry is going to evolve, I think, is kind of what you're trying to ask me.
Kind of, yeah.
It's yeah. It's a really hard one to know. You don't know what you don't know, right? So tech is evolving, kind of ways of working. Look at how everyone uses like ChatGPT and all those sorts of things. So I think there's probably some industry stat out there about how many jobs actually exist. Again, not just related to construction. Like if you were 10 now, how many of those people will end up in a job that exists today? I bet you a huge percentage of those people will end up in jobs that don't exist. So I think people have to kind of like be funneled into kind of generic. So the future jobs of getting people into those kind of areas that don't currently exist is a really hard one because they don't currently exist. So I can't tell you what those roles are because they don't exist yet anyway. So it's a bit of a catch-22. So how do we educate people on things that don't exist when we know they don't exist? It becomes a confusing one. But things will naturally evolve. But actually, a lot of roles are based on core principles. So even though the role doesn't exist, how do you, I don't know, become into a certain, like you can't just use ChatGPT. Like, how do you know something is right? Okay, so how that question actually develops is it's about competence. So if you were to look at any of the institutions and you become a chartered engineer or something like that, and you go through your qualifications, they're measuring competence, which isn't just about education and those bits and pieces, but you roll it all the way back to first principles. When someone looks at ChatGPT response, how do they know that's correct?
Yeah.
Right. So you look at it and you go, it doesn't feel right. And that kind of doesn't feel right. There's those old hats, as we were talking about earlier on construction sites, going, I can walk into a site, I can tell you what the program is, I can tell you where the problems are just by seeing it. How are they actually doing that? Well, that's probably competence. In reality, they've been burnt in the past. So competence is all about experience. Those pain points are going into language models that are educating people to make them make informed decisions with data. And that's where it will probably naturally evolve into that. But someone still has to understand that first principles, because for me, there's a big danger going forwards that people are just going to be trust information that they've been put in front of them, that's gospel truth. And how do we educate people on first principles, for me, is a kind of big challenge going forwards. That these new roles will appear, but people are just going to trust data or trust an answer from a bot that says you should do this. And I think, how do we make sure that people are challenging? And it's going to evolve, obviously, but that needs to be challenged and validated, which is going to be an interesting development to happen.
That's a really interesting point, because I was chatting to somebody earlier who was saying one of the difficulties they're finding now is that subcontractors, not just subcontractors, but subcontractors in general, are starting to use things like ChatGPT and generative AI to create things like RAMs. And, the guy I spoke to was like, they're creating that, they're sending it to the principal contractor, whoever it is, to review it. The principal contractor can read between the lines and tell you that it's generative AI. They then get challenged on it and they go, "Oh yeah, we would have put that in there anyway."
Things to the right process, right? As we kind of started a lot of the conversations on of like these things can help you get a started for 10, right?
Yeah.
So if you don't know where to start, yes, it's doing something, but the fact what they've done on your example is they've done something and then just passed it on and go, oh yeah, we're going to add that in anyway. Well, from my opinion, there's no validation process that's happened in that. Like they've done something, they've not checked it themselves before passing it through, because who you give someone some RAMs, right? And then like someone goes to work and something happens, like who's accountable for that? Who signed it off? Like you can't go, well, it was that bot that told me what to do, right? So there's still someone that has to be fundamentally accountable, and people need to understand that yes, they can do something, but they're the ones that's accountable for some decisions and what you tell someone to do. The extreme one, obviously, if someone tells you to go and walk off the edge of a cliff, if the bot tells you to go walk off the edge of a cliff, do you think that's a good idea? Well, wait a minute, no, that's not a good idea. But oh wait, but there's a bridge there. That makes sense actually. I'm going to walk on over the bridge. Like just because it says that's the right thing to do, does you need to check it and actually have a bit of kind of thought on that process and validate that that is the right process. And also to do that, again, comes back to competence. People need experience to do that and understand what's missing. These systems might get better at doing kind of filling in information, but yeah, there is going to be a huge gap of that. It will be interesting how it develops, that if we can generate things like RAMs for things, but I think it's got a long way to go unless we can cherry pick very precise kind of scenario based of that exact thing, and this is a very exact situation. The interesting one would be to flip it on its head and say, tell me what's missing.
Yeah.
So I've written this one, what's missing? So you're then actually flipping the model in a different way. And so you're actually using it as a validation tool. It might be wrong what it's missing, but then you're checking it, but it might give you some new ideas that you've not thought of. So it's about how people use things, what prompt are they asking it, as opposed to write RAMs. A bit dangerous.
It's quite a clever way, actually, flip it on its head, doesn't it? Because then you, rather than saying, this is what you've missed, you tell them, well, what do you think you've missed?
Yeah.
What trends are you seeing that you're keeping a close eye on particularly across the larger companies? Are there any particular trends in the construction tech space that you're seeing the larger companies adopting that you think other people are going to start to follow?
There's definitely a trend on data ownership. So I think there's been a shift, obviously, of like single source of the truth and the golden thread, how that kind of will continue to develop. They have best in breed and they have lots of different bits of tech, but how do they understand what data they've got, how they're doing it? So they are looking at kind of rationalizing information into a common place, but it's being data driven, because that's unlocking those kind of large language learning from the information they've got, also validation tools. How do you validate that data? So I think that's starting to happen from the contractor side of bringing kind of data together, so you can kind of start surfacing that in whichever ways. That will generate new tech off the back of that, how you kind of start interrogating that data to make informed decisions off the back of it. And I think tech will then start having to become more interoperable to kind of counteract some of that, of how do I move information, as opposed to going, how do I move information from system A to system B to system D? Actually, I just need to go to that one kind of source. There's also kind of a bit of a trend starting to emerge. Obviously, software is helping that, as you kind of look at things like common data environments, that more and more of kind of, there's more and more systems on top of systems. As you go down through the tiers and through the supply chain, the asset owners will have one because they need to kind of manage their own assets. Then the large contractor might have one, then the subcontractor might have one. So, and these can all be different systems. So interoperability of actually efficiently moving information between systems, I think, will eventually have to grow. Otherwise, there's going to be systems off to one side to kind of help that interoperability happen, which is probably also starting to happen. A bit of a pushback from software providers, because they'll see it potentially as a threat to losing a customer. But in reality, from my point, the market's getting an awful lot bigger. So instead of buying a project-based system, it's actually slightly pivoting to an organizational based system. So actually there's a lot more places for kind of the software providers to sell. but we have to kind of get that interoperability working to make sure you know where the truth is based on what perception you've got and how you leave with records. You've got to keep your records for 30 years afterwards. How are you going to keep that on a project where you no longer got access, it's controlled by someone else? So there's different driving forces, and I think it will shift over the next 5 to 10 years.
Interesting. And you just on the interoperability stuff, you mentioned that software providers are potentially reluctant to that. Why do you think that is? Because I don't see it as personally, I don't see it as a threat. If everybody can share their information, the functionality still sits separately to that. So what they choose with the system for is ultimately what that system does, not necessarily. I'm not going to choose based. I'm not going to go, okay, well, this principal contractor is using this, so therefore I'm going to just choose this.
It's probably linking to one of our earlier points on change, because if it's easy to pass information from subcontractor A up to contractor up to client through different systems, is it also easy to change from system A to system B? Because naturally you're starting to do that as well. So there's probably an element of actually after renewal, is it very easy to move to a new system? So there's probably an element of hesitation within that. If you can tie someone into a long-term contract, they're not going to, you're protecting your revenue. Everyone will say it's nice to kind of move information, but the reality is someone's going to still look after kind of their bread and butter and their software. It's going to happen within reason. So we have to find a way to do that shift of this is right. And I'm not sure how that's going to be led. There's obviously a lot of very large organizations there's been public letters about certain ones, about how they're not very interoperable. But if you stay in the ecosystem, take it away from construction, Apple, if you work with an Apple and you try and talk to someone on Android, there's stuff about the messages and the green and blue bubbles and how they're behaving back and forth. Maybe that's still interoperability between people sending text messages. So it should just be, everyone wants it to be smooth, but the reality is you've got different providers making it a little bit difficult, that if you stay in the ecosystem, it works a bit better. So there is that balance that has to be found, I think, but it'll be interesting to see what causes a shift in that interoperability. I know there is like ISO standards out there about these things, but whether they get enacted on and how people understand the reality of interoperability, we don't necessarily have standardized ways of mapping of data of certain things. I work for Amodal. What's my letters, the 3 characters within one system? Is it AMO? Someone else calls it something different. We've got a misalignment. How do you remap data through systems? So I think there's work to be done. There's lots of examples of, you call it tomato, I call it tomato. Things have got to be aligned to allow these things to happen, and we work in quite a changing environment. So yeah, it'll have to evolve, I think.
It's funny, you kind of went on to my next kind of question I was thinking about. There was standardization. Obviously, a lot of people I speak to have unique ways of working, and even some people turn around and say, "Oh, how would you suggest we do it?" And we obviously use what we've seen from other clients, but it doesn't mean necessarily when it's right. Do you think the industry needs to push more towards a standardization or standardized approach to everything that they do?
If I tackle it a slightly different way, everyone thinks they're special. So each building is unique within a way, which I do appreciate. But why is it unique? Like they should fundamentally, the end output is unique, but the processes you're following should be the same. So why do we re-engineering processes because of a very slight nuance in something? We shouldn't be doing that. And I think if we start looking at it for, wait a minute, we are doing it in the same way, as opposed to saying, no, I'm different. You start with, no, I'm different, so I can't do it that way. It's the negative way of like, actually, we should be standardized. Our processes are the same. We shouldn't change that. So hopefully you start becoming a bit more positive on, wait a minute, we can do this, as opposed to no, and changing for change's sake to make sure. I think also in the industry, there's a slight thing of, engineers are very good at fixing things.
Yeah.
So you see a barrier, and what do? You put a plaster on it. Someone that told me once. So when you step back after a while, you end up with plaster on top of plaster on top of plaster, because we've got engineers designing processes. We need standardization. It's just, how do we get there? the theory is nice. It's just going to be quite a long journey. Everyone, as we said, everyone thinks they're different. So it's about how do we look at how we are similar, and then actually only engineer around what is truly different. Yeah, people have done things in a certain way for a long time. If you look at some of the oil and gas industry of their processes, the airport out there, and actually kind of other kind of like large buildings, their processes that they've been in and how they call things, they have got nuances within them, and things are just ingrained within ways of working. We do end up with people within specialist area or with kind of a specialist organization, but how do we change that wider culture of things? If I said to you, an example of standardization for me would be if I said to a design manager, status A, they will know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Status B, status C. If I said status D, some of them might go, what are you using D for? We use it for this, we use it for that. So we've got an element of inconsistency on what status D is, if it even exists at all. But there is actually an element of standardization. But then in the kind of profession, as you start to roll that into a system, we can end up in a long conversation of what do they actually mean? Is it authorized? Is it accepted? And there's a nuance within a contract clause. But fundamentally, people know it's like thumbs up, right? I'm not saying it's got to be an emoji, but that's all good. There's a slight warning on a B, red, don't do anything with. Fundamentally, that's actually what we're trying to say. So there's standardization, but there's nuance within those things that either should be worked through, but do they need to be worked through? You know, sometimes it's gone. If we simplify it a bit, we can get to a standardization, knowing that there's a variation within a contract of actually on this project, that means that. And you end up with having these accepted and authorized contract terms of what does it actually mean. Everyone knows what you're doing. It seems to be silly conversations that drive inconsistency.
Tomato situation again.
Yeah, exactly.
And just on that, kind of wrapping up that standardization piece, do you feel like it's something that needs to be enforced from the government or public sector side of things, or do you think it's something that needs to be done by a separate body that kind of stands up for construction?
The question is which body, if it was to be a body.
Yeah.
So I think I don't feel currently there is an institution out there that's representing. So it's, but what is that body? It's not an engineering. It's not ICE. It's not RICS. There isn't really a body that's representing some of that kind of area. I would say they'll all have their own subsets, but there will be specialist subsets within those kind of organizations. So it needs, if it comes from a body, then which is the body? If it comes from the government, how are the government being informed? Would be that question. It's easier to roll out the government mandates something. So it feels like the government should try and lead the way, but it's how are they advised and who are the people to advise them? I think that probably needs to develop with time, and some organization probably needs to step forward to kind of to do that.
Got some final closing questions for you.
Go for it.
Quick fire, 5 questions. Just give me an answer, either or. Simple to use or packed with features?
Simple to use.
Plug and play or custom built?
Oh, I would say plug and play.
Fix it.
Ideally.
Fix it fast or get it perfect?
Oh, I'm a bit of a perfectionist, so unfortunately get it perfect, but ideally fix it fast.
Fix the process or train the people?
Fix the process, but with the caveat of you need to understand how the people work, because the process probably isn't broken. Like the people don't necessarily need educating if they work different to the process. The process, fundamentally, it's not necessarily the people. It's usually the process. It's written by an incorrect person, so slight nuance, but the process. Yeah.
Last one. Industry leader or disruptive innovator?
I'd rather go disruption.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, like yeah.
Go on, explain.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the industry's got a long way to go, right? So we need to disrupt things as much as anything. Like, yeah, things have got to change. And how are you going to do that? Yes, you can kind of. I think leading is good for a certain point. So I look at other areas outside of construction and go like academia, right? For me, academia is the way of leading, of like pushing things out, a standardization of like in theory what should be done. But it loops back to the previous question about the process of how's it done in reality. So if that's perfection of how we want to be, how do we get from where we are to that point? And the only way you're going to do that is disrupting and not doing straight to that point, because that change curve is too big. Get perfect. We've got a long way to go, a lot to learn on that journey. So we're going to have to kind of change some things, work a bit different to perfect. But I think we had a conversation earlier on an 80-20 sort of rule. I'd rather be 80% right than I've got to work on that final 20% to get to the kind of where I need to be, trying to get that perfect piece, even though I do like the perfection side of it, we can strive for perfection. But we've got to start making moves and start going forward. Otherwise, everything, when you look at the whole, everything to change, we'll get nowhere. So make some difficult calls and do some difficult things.
Awesome. Thanks very much for coming on. Really appreciate your time today.
No worries.